This involves a process composed of 4 interrelated elements: D, diagnosis; T, treatment; R, rehabilitation; and P, prevention. In attempting to treat the disease or diseased state of Jamaica, once a pathogen is identified, the next step is to apply the requisite treatment for the appropriate period of time in the right dosage. At the same time, it's necessary to rehabilitate the patient, to restore functioning to pre-disease levels, and to take action to prevent recurrence in the carrier patient or infection of other persons. That is the prevention piece. And we all know, we say prevention is better than cure. Now, of course, sometimes no cure can be effected as the disease remains undiagnosed, or the treatment simply ameliorates the symptoms, or the patient refuses treatment. Worse, the patient continues to be infectious, and before long, many more are suffering disease and disease. And all of this must be guarded against. So, as a doctor playing as a pseudo MD, my diagnosis is that Jamaica and Jamaicans are suffering from an ailment in the country's moral system that has affected all of our other functioning systems. The political, the corporate, the social, the spiritual, the personal, all of these have been affected by a particular disease. The symptoms of this disease are apparent, they're numerous, they're pervasive, and some of the symptoms include widespread disrespect of each other, murder, rape, larceny, dishonesty, cruelty to women, children, animals, violence, intimidation, the very ailments, I think, that were identified by the children's drawings. I'm calling this disease MDS, Moral Degenerative Syndrome. It's caused by a plethora of germs or pathogens. It's transmitted via various vectors and flourishes where risk factors are present. The individual body and the larger social body builds up resistance to various treatments very rapidly, and pathogens mutate regularly. This makes the disease particularly difficult to treat. Consequently, relapse and reinfection are entirely possible. Now, the causative agents for MDS, in my estimation, include poor socialization, inappropriate values and attitudes, lack of personal responsibility, reduced moral sensitivity, moral imagination, reduced moral reasoning, and a process of moral disengagement. Moral despair or fatalism represents another key pathogen that is difficult to identify, but maybe even more present than we realize, and it can serve to undermine our efforts at moral regeneration. These germs function by attacking directly the core character of the Jamaican person, by deforming our values, deforming our attitudes and habits in a fashion that make us unable to be good citizens, or maybe make us unable to be good human beings. Such misshapen character elicits the behavior that forms the symptoms of MDS. At the same time, the society and the various communities of which it is composed present an environment that supports the flourishing of the germs that are the source of MDS, in the same way that stagnant water is in discarded containers is a perfect breeding ground for the dengue-carrying Aedes aegypti mosquito. And I don't know, you probably didn't notice because I moved through so quickly the early slides, but one of the children actually drew a huge black mosquito sort of attacking the people in Jamaica now. So clearly the presence of epidemic might not be lost on our children either. Now, I want to argue that MDS germs flourish in an environment that is marked by high levels of degrading poverty, highly stratified and unequal social relations, morally bankrupt leadership at all levels, education without values, and unjust systems of justice, consumerist taste embellished by global incursions, and of course the list goes on. Transmission of the cocktail of germs takes place through education, mass media, popular culture, and of course family life. The symptoms, germs, vectors, and risk factors are overlapping and I believe to be mutually reinforcing at the same time. What I consider to be this virtual medical moral nightmare that we're living in as Jamaicans. Cause leads to effect, and effect influences cause in an ever-cascading spiral. Clearly, treating such a disease characterized by an unending multiplicity of symptoms, agents, and risk factors is by no means simple, straightforward, or quick. Indeed, treatment may take several generations, several adjustments of dosage, amputations even, yeah? And who knows, regular blood transfusions and heavy doses of radiation therapy. Treatment, rehabilitation, and prevention may be all of a piece, overlapping and multifunctional. So I hope by now you've caught a sense of just how dire things are and how complex and complicated our situation and our circumstance is. In the text of the lecture itself, I put in 3 scenarios that I attempt to discuss in depth to help to pull out a little bit more as to how I see the disease affecting and influencing us, and how character and choice and community play an important role in that process and are themselves sort of deformed by this disease. For tonight's discussion, I'm only going to talk through one of the scenarios, and I'm going to do it just very briefly. Now, the scenario that I'm choosing to talk through with you tonight is about a young woman, and it's a fictionalized scenario, but it's one that I'm sure you'll recognize at any point because it's so much a part of our reality. It's about a young woman, and I'm making her up, but she could very well exist, and I call her Lorraine, and she's a UTech student. Apologies to all my UTech friends. And she was befriended by a bus conductor named Horace from her high school days, and he took care of her financially, of course with her mother's tacit agreement. And you know, a few months after Horace ends up going to jail for manslaughter, she finds out that she's pregnant. Shortly after that, say within a month or so, she's befriended by a lecturer from UTech named Michael. And then what does she do? She takes the decision that she's going to tell Horace that he's the father of her unborn child. Sound familiar? Michael, that he's the father of her unborn child. Yeah. Name, same name, right? So, you know, her story is not unique, right? And in fact, Tanya has a piece on one of her albums that is entitled Little White Lie. And you know, many people hear that piece and they don't hear the complexity of the piece, at least in terms of my analysis of it. And they listen to that piece and they see it as her sort of giving support to women who engage in this practice that is really, really deeply deceptive and dishonest, you know? But when I listen to that particular track, what I recognize is that Tanya is saying to us that this phenomenon, because it's a phenomenon, the figures are out there that, you know, maybe 15% of our children have been given to the wrong fathers, right? And what she's actually saying to us is that it's a lot more complex than we even realize. The woman herself who gets involved in the deception suffers. A lot of times we don't really recognize that wrongdoing can and does bring harm to us as individuals. Because most times we feel, because we benefit, we get away, that there is no harm done to us. But this piece, and I recommend that you go listen to it again, really talk to us about how that woman can suffer and the fear that she lives in of being caught. So, this act of what we call jacketing, and I have called the piece in the text a suitable choice. And you see the play on the word suit, jacket, right? So, a case like this raises the question of the character of the women involved. What kind of woman knowingly and calculatingly gives her child to the wrong father? Usually a man that is more financially able, you know? How does one judge character in this situation? Now, there are a couple possible ways of assessing good character that I think my fictionalized scenario highlights. First, to be good is to be loving. That is recognizing, respecting, and responding to the worth of others. Many of us as Jamaicans walk around, encounter each other, and what we encounter frontally and face to face is the disrespect of our person and our worth and our value by the way others speak to us, the way they treat us, the way they deal with us. I think this is an example of that being at play. This means that a good person does not focus on his or her interests only, but is able to care about the interests of others. It's difficult, therefore, to see how Lorraine's choices express a loving response that goes beyond herself and seeks the good of Michael, Horace, and her unborn child, because the good of the child is not only economic, eh? You will agree with me on that count. Second, to be good is to be virtuous, and that is to cultivate good moral habits, affections, attitudes, and beliefs that lead to genuine human fulfillment, even perfection, on both personal and social levels. Virtues contrast with vices, which are bad moral habits, affections, attitudes, and beliefs that hinder human progress both socially and personally. Lorraine seems to have developed habits, attitudes, and beliefs that hinder genuine fulfillment for both herself and the men whom she deceives. She is engaged in repeated acts of deception and dependence, and showed herself committed to being and becoming a kind of dependent, self-centered, deceptive individual. Her inner attitudes were deepened through constant effort and choice, and this is something I want to emphasize. Deepened by constant effort and choice, we make ourselves into the kinds of persons that we are by choice and effort. In her choices, Lorraine treated the men simply as means to an end, that malleability of morals, that is to her own advantage. Lorraine can be shown to lack the virtues of honesty, fortitude, justice, and openness, and so would lack the inner harmony that comes from their presence and interaction. And that's the kind of inner harmony that I'm hearing Tanya have us reflect on a bit in that piece, A Little White Lie. Justice, in particular, demands that Lorraine should be oriented to treat each man and her child fairly and giving to each man his due. Now think about it. Fatherhood comes with certain responsibilities and demands various kinds of resources and investments, including financial and emotional investments. By taking on to herself this suitable choice, what Lorraine is doing is that she's depriving one man of his due, that is his fatherly rights, and she's placing a burden on another man, which is not his to carry. The child itself will be deprived of the truth of its genetic heritage. That is what this child is also due. Now, importantly, if we're going to examine Lorraine's character, her beliefs, her habits, attitudes, and so on, we must recognize that her deformed character and choices have to be put against the background of Jamaica. Jamaica today, where levels of poverty and joblessness often force women into transactional sex in order to access resources to survive. Misshapen understandings of relationship, sexuality, child rearing, and parenting boast up such choices and craft characters like Michael that expect to be exploited for resources, and they exploit in turn, even younger girls. Undoubtedly, also, Lorraine's character was nurtured by her mother, whose acceptance of and willingness to support the actions of her daughter in developing habits of dependence and dishonesty set the stage for the inculcation of such vices. This is not an easy judgment for me to stand here as a Jamaican woman and make. And I know I've made many of you uncomfortable just by even choosing this particular scenario as one that I'd share with you in trying to point out to you just how misshapen our Jamaican character can be at the core. But I hope that even as you're disturbed by that particular scenario that I've painted, that you'll take some steps back and look at what that scenario is pointing out to us, and how much each of us might be implicated in having misshapen characters ourselves, even if they don't show up in the particular way that they show up in the scenario that I'm presenting to you this evening. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about a particular cognitive or moral process that I also find to be very strongly at work in Jamaica. So I'm not going to talk to you more about the particular scenarios that I have in the book itself. I'll tell you when you get your opportunity, do read them and reflect on them a little bit. But I want to talk to you about this whole idea of what is called moral disengagement, because I also see this as one of the key germs that has been gnawing away at our Jamaican character, gnawing away at our Jamaican society. And I want you to engage with me a little bit around this particular concept. Now, in studies of unethical behavior, particularly in the concept of the workplace, which is a type of community that I believe is a microcosm of our larger society. There has been this continuous search after some kind of explanatory construct, as well as instruments to measure propensity to engage in ethical misconduct. So think about it, if we could find a way to measure when people are going to behave badly, they would be way ahead of the game, because then we could, catch them, weed them out, and, do some prevention at the outset. Now, the work on business ethics, and that's one of the areas that I do quite a bit of my work on, while being specific to organizations and their internal dynamics, bears much relationship to the circumstances of society, and I believe has a lot to teach us. Now, I looked at the work of a woman called Celia Moore, where she presented us the idea of moral disengagement, which she defined as, and I quote, an individual's propensity to evoke cognitions which structure one's actions to appear less harmful, minimize one's understanding of responsibility for one's actions, or attenuate the perception of the distress that one causes to others, end quote. So this theory of moral disengagement was developed to explain why certain people are able to engage in inhuman conduct without apparent distress. So individuals with high levels of moral disengagement have made habitual use of cognitive mechanisms, and cognitive is just, thought mechanism, ways of framing reality, which reframe those individuals' actions in a way that downplay their ethical content or import, thus suspending the self-regulatory processes that socio-cognitive theory suggests governs individual moral behavior. So the recognition of moral disengagement as a habitual process alerts us to the self-chosen nature of the process and its direct impact on character. Moral disengagement is not conceptualized as a stable trait. So, somebody can be a happy person all the time. That's a stable trait. More than likely, they'll always be like that. But, moral disengagement is not stable. It's not always going to be with the person. This is a trait that can be influenced by training, by interactions with case studies and all of that. We also recognize that it develops over time, and that is influenced by the social context within which persons operate. So it's very important for us to recognize that as we surface and reflect on this concept, it's not a concept that we can't do something about. All right? Now, let's talk about the mechanisms of moral disengagement. And there are 8 different mechanisms by which moral disengagement occurs. And I think all 8 of these mechanisms are to be seen at work in MDS-infected Jamaica. These mechanisms can be gathered into 3 groups based on how they work. So group 1, restructure the act to appear less harmful. Group 2, minimize the role of the perpetrator. And group 3, minimizes the true consequences that these actions have on other people. Let me explain to you what I mean. The first 3 of these mechanisms, moral justification, euphemistic labeling, advantageous comparison, facilitate the restructuring of inhumane acts to appear less harmful to the individual affected by them. These ways of thinking work by making the act seem beneficial in some way. So for example, and some of you might be familiar with Vybz Kartel's piece, Reparations, where he talks about scamming. So he uses the mechanism of moral justification, because it involves telling himself that scamming is a means of providing education, food, and the good life, while simply redistributing the resources that belong to the descendants of enslaved people. Similarly, it involves euphemistic labeling that renames harmful actions and makes them appear benign. One or two of them that I have issue with in our Jamaican context is where we, for example, label stealing as taking, or, I know we have little young people in the audience. We say rape is just taking a piece, right? So unethical acts in Jamaica are often accompanied also by this dismissive phrase, I know nothing, right? So scamming is just another means of earning income for those who are unable to sing, who can't dance, or who can't run fast. So maybe that means I should really be involved in scamming because I can't do any of those 3 things. What about advantageous comparisons? it draws on even more harmful activities to make the action in question seem innocuous by contrast. So when Vybz Kartel says in his song Reparations that scamming doesn't deal with gun violence and that in fact it's a foreign exchange earner, you really have to ask him, my boy, you serious? You know? What about the second group, where we displace responsibility or we diffuse responsibility to minimize the role of the individual?